policy that he's going to give. Thank you.
Once we have the presentation, is the presentation ready?
Hello. Yes. So I was obviously very pleased when I was asked to come here for this discussion, because this is a subject that is very close to my heart for a number of reasons. One is, you don't often find a policy measure that illustrates so many of the issues that those of us in civil society talk about all the time as this one. Issues about how you design policy effectively. So in the course of this presentation, what I'm going to try and achieve is to walk you through a journey of policy analysis. That is the context in which I'm coming from. You know, it's like, okay, this is a government policy. How should they have gone about it? And now that they've gone about it the way that they've done, what can we expect going forward? So this is an academic setting. So it's going to be slightly more academic than usual, but, you know, we'll see how it goes. And I don't have a clicker here, so my good friend and the IT team is going to help me navigate from slide to slide. Okay. Okay, so first of all, we're going to start with some very basic concepts. Not really tax concepts, because we have a tax expert here who's going to take us through that. But policy concepts, policy-related concepts. We're going to start off by putting up this equation. This is probably going to be the only equation you're going to see in this presentation. But this equation is very important. It gives you a relation between money as fiat. Because a lot of time we think of money, but we confuse it with wealth or value or other things. But I'm talking of money as that object. So that either the physical paper or the electronic that you actually use, separate from what you can use it to buy or what it represents. And then V, velocity, how fast that money moves around. So if I give you 100 cedis and you give 100 cedis to Mr. Nachia and you give 100 cedis to Madam Moderator and you kind of move it around pretty quickly, very soon all of us have had 50 cedis, right? And if we use one period, which is whatever the period, or let's say an hour or a day, we find out that 50 cedis or that 100 cedis all of a sudden becomes 1,000 cedis. Because all of us have had 100 cedis within the same period. So that is what we mean by velocity. If you multiply the money that is moving around in the economy with how fast it's moving, you get the prices and the transactions attached to them, or roughly speaking, you get a GDP, the total income in the economy. So this is a very basic equation. I'm not approaching from the economics point of view where we can go into, you know, the rabbit hole. It's just a basic policy concept to understand that we have to distinguish between money, how it's moving around to circulate in the economy and therefore to generate transactions. And therefore, by looking at it in that way, we get closer to understand what E-Levy means. Next slide, please. Okay, now that you understand this concept, or if you understood it already, now that we've gone through this concept, we can start to look at a very problematic concept, but one that I want you to keep at the back of your mind, something called E-money base. Normally in the economy, we have the monetary base. And the monetary base is, in standard terms, simply the actual stock of money that is generating the transactions in the economy. In the digital realm, we have something similar, but much harder to get your finger across. I'm not going to go into the complexity. But think of the fact that when you put some money in your mobile money account, that is real money, that's, you know, it's real value. But as you start to circulate it, like I described earlier, it starts to multiply. And in the course of its multiplying, you generate something more than what you put there, because you give it to somebody else who then buys something else, etc. So without going to the depths of the detail of how we get to a E-money base, the point is that there's some stock which is other than what you are moving around. And I'll come back to this point again, but it puts into context the fact that when you look at current mobile money circulation, the transactional value is about $110 billion, nearly 2 times Ghana's GDP. That's the value of the transactions that mobile money is being used to fuel in the economy. That suddenly makes it look like, oh, there's a lot of money sitting there. They're going to just go take a bit of it. When I scale it down to what is the actual base, and I'm not going to go into how I derive the base because it's just too complex for this short talk. But when I pull it down to, okay, but it's not all that money that's moving around, that is actual value, you get something far less, about $9 billion. Keep that in mind because we'll come back to it again later on in the slides. In short, when you just look at the raw numbers, it looks as if there's a lot of money going around in Ghana and government should get a share. You know, there's like $110 billion of mobile money transactions. There's an additional $30 billion of check processing, checks that people are just cashing out in the economy. There's a lot of money. Of course, government should get a share. In subsequent conversations, I'll try and explain why that's not that simple. Please move. The other very basic concept I want you to understand is this concept that in economics is very common, called elasticity. When you are comparing two things, two dynamic transactions, for instance, there is always the possibility that one can replace the other. Or if you move one, there is an impact on the other. So in that context, we will probably, in the case of E-Levy, we'll be looking at payment methods and what are the elasticity or substitution among them. If you move from checks to mobile money, you move from mobile money to checks, how does movement in one impact the other, and how easy is it to move from one to the other, etc.? I'm not going to go into depth about how we compute this and what, but it's usually empirical. Usually how you determine what the actual elasticity is, it's not theory. You actually go and do real research, and you get some numbers, and you say, okay, if I do this, this is what will happen to the other factor. So what you want to bear in mind is that in looking at E-Levy, you are also interested in understanding what will happen to movement among the different payment methods. If you put a tax on this one, will people shift to that one? And the one that most people have talked about is the movement towards cash, which we'll talk a little about again. Next slide, please. Okay. The other thing that I think is also interesting, the slide is a bit hard to look at, but generally, the way in which the cash move is interesting in some types of analysis. We have something we call consumer to consumer, so you paying your brother or your mom, consumer to business, you paying a business, or the business paying you. Let's say if I'm doing payroll, it's a kind of B2C transaction because I'm a business, I'm paying you as a consumer. We have payments to government, etc. All of these things can be very impactful when you start to analyze because how the money moves and for what purpose it's moving is sometimes impacted by the direction of travel. And I'll come to that also. Next slide. The other thing that I think is critical, in fact, this is my first real point. Everything else was just building up to a point. My first real point is that the biggest problem with E-Levy as it was introduced and the way that they've gone about it is the complete absence of any modeling. Nobody did any modeling. The government just literally got up, decided that this is how I'm going to do it, and this is the amount. It's the cap is 100 cedis. There will be no threshold. If you do $1 million, we will keep charging you the same percentage. We will decide what the exemptions are. If you are paying a loan, then there's an exemption. But if you are paying your child school fees, there's no exemption, or things like that. There was zero attempt to engage the policy community, to engage the civil society community, different interest groups, and try and analyze this. Usually, how would they analyze it though? The most basic approach is something we call a dynamic, stochastic, and general equilibrium model. What this attempts to do is to try and simplify an economy so that you can see what happens when... Oh, sorry. I think we have a little feedback from some of the electronics. When you move back to... When you do a model like this, what it tells you is some very interesting things. Like, okay, if I introduce a tax, and because of the tax, people consume less of something, what happens to other things? One of the basic things that the government obviously should have done was to look at the impact of this particular tax on other types of taxes in the economy. So for instance, will this affect VAT? Because I'm consuming less because it's less convenience to buy. If it's less convenience for me to buy, maybe I buy less, and because I buy less, I pay less consumption taxes. Example being VAT. Now, this kind of modeling activity is usually basic. In any economy, you will not have something of the status of, or the stature or the prominence of E-Levy come about unless the government has taken time to model the likely effects, including things like where they got 100 cities from. And I'll prove to you in subsequent slides and the rest of it that all of this was arbitrary. All those numbers they are mentioned around, none of it was based on any actual modeling or was based on any serious analysis, particularly econometric analysis, to determine what is the right ratios and the rest of it. And this was from those of us from civil society, that was our biggest problem. We had not yet come to a view on whether we like E-Levy or not, because without understanding what type of E-Levy, any kind of conversation is arbitrary. Because you can design E-Levy in so many different ways. Through your exemptions, through your thresholds, through the caps you use, through the rate you choose, it can have so many different effects. There's no one E-Levy. It depends on how you design it. And until you've done the careful work of designing it properly, based on careful analysis, our argument is that it's very difficult for anybody to engage intelligently with the subject. Next slide. Okay, next slide. So, initially, I told you about this concept of a E-base. I'm going to use a more familiar concept, something that is already widely accepted. And that is this notion of E-money floats. How much money is actually stacked in, say, mobile money? How much have actually people put in their mobile money wallets? Because if you try and follow the transactional value, like I explained to you, because of the multiplier effect, can be very difficult. But you can simply look at how much money people have actually put in the wallet. And if you do that, next slide, you will find something really interesting. These are some key numbers from Ghana that kind of give you an idea of what we are talking about. Let's start with how much on average do people keep in their e-money wallet. It's around $30. That's the rough number, so around 200 and something cedis. It's roughly how much people have in the average person have in their mobile money wallet. So that's interesting. You can look at how many people have e-money in Ghana. It's about 80 million people, or have mobile money in Ghana, about 80 million people. And how much money in total are in these wallets? It's about $540 million. But what you want to be looking at is how much money people have in their bank accounts. That is about $18 billion. So mobile money is actually pretty small, even though all the focus has been on mobile money. About only 1% of the digital money wealth in Ghana is actually mobile money. A lot of it's actually in bank accounts. What people have not realized is that this is not just a Momo tax. I think Madam Moderator has already said that. This is also very much an electronic financial transactions tax. Every time you move money that is digital, they take tax. And it's not Momo that is probably going to be hit the most, it's your bank account itself, literally. So calling it a Momo tax and kind of focus on the Momo tax distorts the real impact. Next slide. The other thing that I also think is important is some of the questions that I think we need to ask before we start delving into the analysis itself. Next slide. There are a few critical questions. One of them is the elasticity issue that I raised. How can if I didn't want to pay mobile money, can I move quickly to cash or some other version? If I found out that there's an exemption, I don't know if there's an exemption, am I able to change my pattern in order to avoid the tax? Those things are going to be very critical. What is the volume of transactions that are associated with this whole Momo 10 or e-money or whatever we call it? Then what I call care, the caps, the aggregates, the rates, and the exemptions. They are the most fundamental in all the discussion you're going to have, because the way you set those things determine everything about e-levy. How much should the cap be? What should be the rate? What things are exempted, etc. Those to me I think are fundamental. And that analysis, to me, the lack of analysis in that area was the biggest flaw so far. Next slide. Next slide. We know from the fact that mobile money or e-money or e-levy type taxes are new in Ghana, that a lot of people have looked at it from a novelty point of view. We don't know how it will behave. The truth, though, is that this is actually not an innovative tax at all. It's not like something brilliant or genius that the government came about. We've had similar things in history, and the fact that we've had similar things in history enables us to look at what happened with those types of things in order to be able to analyze better. One example of a tax in some other places that looks suspiciously like e-levy is remittance tax. So for instance, that I should change it. Okay, hello. Okay. One tax type that looks suspiciously like e-levy is taxes on remittances. Remittances, money that you send from one country to another, basically crosses an international border. So if you get money from Western Union or TransferWise, etc. Now, there are countries that have tried to tax those things. And they are very similar to mobile money because you tax the actual money that is in motion, as opposed to property, wealth, income, or consumption, which is usually the kind of thing you tax. If you are taxing the money that's just moving, it's not very conventional. But I'm trying to explain that remittances behave very similar, because also I'm sending money to my mother in the village. I'm in Chicago, and I want to send money across, and you tax from that amount. So my argument is that remittance taxes are a great example if you just want to look at a case study similar to e-levy, but not e-levy. And we have experience from 3 major countries: Tajikistan, Philippines, Vietnam. And in all of those instances, what we know is that they abolished the tax after a while. So in Vietnam, for instance, they had a 5% tax. 1997, they abolished it, and it led to significant growth in remittances. In the Philippines, in 1995, they abolished it. But watch how far back I'm talking about. So people have experimented with similar things years ago and found out that it has huge negative effects on what it is that you put that tax on. So if you put it on remittances, it affects how much the remittances can grow. In fact, when they took the 5% tax off the Vietnam remittance channel, or that stream of revenue into Vietnam, remittance grew by 5 times. As soon as they took off the tax, in the subsequent years, it grew by 5 times. So that's very interesting. The other point is that in Ghana, mobile money actually operates like a remittances channel. Because there's a huge disparity between the north. No, please go back to the old slide. There's a huge disparity between the north and the south, to the point where a lot of people send money from the south to the north. But even bigger is the gap between rural areas and urban areas. In fact, more people send money from urban areas in the south to rural areas in the south than they send from urban areas in the south to rural areas in the north. So what that means is that a lot of people, that is basically how they survive. In some instances, in some of the research that has been conducted, as much as maybe 30% of some people's income in rural areas, it depends on mobile money flows coming in from the south. So all of this means that the remittances issue that I was discussing in other jurisdictional contexts can also apply here directly, as in the way that we look at it. Next slide, please. The other thing, next slide. The other thing that I think is really interesting is that E-Levy has a fascinating ability to snowball. What that means is that if you are a producer, let's say you make mango juice, and you pay money to buy mangoes, you pay E-Levy. When you pay money for the laborers that are working on that mango juice, you pay E-Levy. When the thing is ready and you buy packaging to package it, you pay E-Levy. When you pack it and you get, the driver is taking it to the supermarket, you pay E-Levy again. By the time the goods get on the shelf and the supermarket, you pay E-Levy. All of those steps, you are paying tax. That is not the way a lot of other taxes behave, and people forget that. What this is doing is that it's penalizing productive steps. It's like if you have any kind of production system which has multiple steps, you get penalized because you pay tax every time you move money in each of those steps. If on the other hand, you do buy and sell, you have only one productive step, I buy and I sell, you pay less tax. So this is a punitive tax on manufacturing or any other complex economic activity because of the productive steps involved. And that snowballing effect is not something that most people have averted their minds to. Next slide. And I'll be going much quicker because I know my time is short. The other issue that people have also not observed is that they have not looked at the actual business model of E-Levy. And that comes from the very bad approach to the policy making process. By not actually going there and studying what it is. So they don't realize that for a lot of people, the way they access mobile money is not through their own phone. It's to walk to an agent, give them money, and the agent does the transfer for them. For most people in the rural areas and for most poor people, that's actually how they experience mobile money. So if I am a mobile money operator and somebody comes to me and I'm using my account to do the transfer, then all the accumulation or the cumulation is on my account. So that 100 CD threshold that you are talking about is meaningless. Because very soon, after I've done 10 of the transfers, I have 1,000 CD spent. And I've already exceeded the 100 CD threshold that you set up. Move on to the next one. The other thing that is also important, as I've already said, is that if you look at the exemption criteria, it's arbitrary. And what is fascinating about all of this is, in history, we've seen very similar things as far back as 1791. In 1791, the United Kingdom introduced a tax on checks. Every time you pay a check, you pay a certain amount of money, just because you are issuing a check. This goes back to 1791. 200 and what? 30 years? So, what happened when they did this? Next slide. Next slide. One of the first things that they decided to discover was that design is everything, like I've been saying. How you design the way the tax operates. In fact, it got to a point where the issue was whether or not you should let the bank itself print the stamp or you should do the stamp and send it to the bank. That alone became a matter for parliamentary debate. Next slide. And then they started to discover that you have to make some exemptions, as you always do with these taxes. But the way and manner in which you make the exemptions began to look arbitrary over time. So first they said, well, if you live within 10 kilometers of the bank, then you don't pay the tax. I mean, why 10 kilometers? So it's very similar to if you pay up to 100 cedis, don't pay the tax. What does it mean? Where is it coming from? Then they say later on, a couple of years, decades later, they say, okay, actually, let's make it 15 kilometers. So you go on with these arbitrary exemptions until eventually, next slide, you discover that it's just a bad law. And hundreds of years after this, in 1971, the government finally repealed the stamp duty tax on checks in the United Kingdom. Because it just doesn't work from a point of view of how much money it makes, plus the impact on people's behavior, which is very critical with this kind of taxes. Next slide. Also, you find out that the way different countries approach it can be very different in the way they set up their mobile money and electronic financial systems. And because of that fact, how much you actually charge as a tax also differs significantly among countries. In fact, Ghana is the biggest, right now it's gone down to 1.5%. I have to update the slide. But on the whole, Ghana charges the most compared, the only country that charges more is Zimbabwe. in terms of this. These are the countries that are already doing this in Africa. So we have significant experience also from a cross-country perspective. The key insight to learn here is that in Ghana, the rate is high compared to other places. And number two, the way they've set up in countries differ, which means, therefore, that when you are designing, you need to pay attention. Because the reason why other countries have it different could be that because it's a result or an outcome of careful analysis and debate. So why is that countries do it differently? And why is that Ghana has chosen to do it this specific way? Next slide. This is a very important slide. This is actually the business model of MTN in mobile money. What you will discover here is fascinating because a lot of people assume that the way mobile money works is identical across the board. But that's not how as far as the operators themselves are concerned, that's not actually how it operates. You will see that when you are trying to use mobile money to pay Ghana Water, they don't charge you. Or to pay your school fees where the school is a subscriber of the scheme, they don't charge you. You will also see that there are multiple items where they've decided that for some strategic reason, they will not charge you. Now, all of this is based on somebody's careful analysis of the business case for mobile money. Somebody who has spent years developing it. Now, when you come and you impose a tax across the board like that, you distort everything. All of a sudden, things that were free to a lot of people, they have to pay. But the question is, why did they decide to make it free? Are you better at understanding the behavior of agents, the behavior of users, more than MTN, who has been doing this for so many years, when you spent less than a month designing your tax? Next slide. Next slide, please. Next slide. You'll also discover that there are some interesting developments in the economy which are related to moving money within the economy that sometimes you cannot anticipate because you're not an economic actor yourself as a government. One quick example is two things. One, when you think of what is government, so for instance, they are saying that if you use Ghana.gov, then you are paying the government and therefore you are exempt. What they are not recognizing is that besides that particular channel, there are a lot of quasi-government transactions. All of cocoa has been more or less nationalized. So all the movement of money to farmers and the rest that they are using mobile money and things like that, they are all part of the government ecosystem in terms of payments. The critical thing here, next slide, is that if you don't pay attention to the complexity of the market ecosystem as a whole, you make assumptions that don't hold. They have decided, for instance, that when it comes to credit, they are not going to pay, you're not going to pay the tax if you are repaying a loan. But the problem with not paying a tax if you are repaying a loan is that I have to know you are repaying a loan. So the assumption is that everyone that is currently a banking or financial institution will change their external systems so that they will distinguish between what's payment is for a loan and what is not for a loan, and how do they detect? How do you actually verify that that particular transaction is for a loan or it's not for a loan, etc.? So the cost of administration is now being shifted from the government to the person who runs the platform to make all these discriminations that they are trying to introduce into the system. It's also important that we recognize the fact that not everybody that is paying with mobile money is part of the digital economy per se. A lot of people, they pay mobile money, but they're doing offline transactions. Whereas a lot of people make payments that are on the platform, but necessarily they have a challenge. They have a challenge because they are not operating within the digital economy as a whole. And being able to know, actually go forward, sorry. Forward. No, forward as opposed to back. No, forward. Forward. And all of those things therefore mean that when we're designing these things, it helps to pay attention to the way things really work in the economy. To wrap up, let me give you very quick examples of what has happened in other countries, because all of you know that Ghana is not the first country to try and introduce this. In Uganda, there were protests on the streets. Maybe that is an important benchmark for gauging the quality of Ghana's civil society. Because in my experience, every country that have introduced this without sufficient consultation, there were protests and the government backed down. In Ghana, there's been very few protests, even though there was no consultation in advance. In Uganda, the government was forced to slash the tax to 0.5%, remove it from almost everything apart from Momo, and to limit it purely to receiving. So that was interesting. In Malawi, they took it off and they never brought it back. In Cote d'Ivoire, they took it off and never brought it back. In Cameroon, they took it off, put it on the telcos instead, and never brought it back. So in all of these instances, we've had situations where government has listened to the pushback. Back. Next one. Nigeria is interesting. Nigeria is one of the countries where they do this. But you find out that in Nigeria, the reason why there's been no discussion at all is because they set it up at a very small level, and they said it's on only 10,000 naira and above, and it's still capped at 50 naira. So it doesn't matter how much you do after 10,000 naira. You pay 50 naira and that's it. It's not like this one, which is ad valorem. It's a percentage. If you pay 1 million, it increases. If you pay 2 million, it doubles. This is a fixed tax in Nigeria. So one of the reasons why in Nigeria you've not seen a lot of agitation is due to the fact that they decided to do it very differently. Next slide, please. And so my conclusions, next slide. Here is a very important slide. One of the challenges we've had with taxation in Ghana, as I've said repeatedly in this conversation, is the poor attempt at design effectiveness, the care in which we design the tax. Many people think that when VAT was being introduced, it was just being introduced as a fresh tax. No. VAT was introduced to replace the sales and services tax. So there was already a tax on consumption. But VAT was seen as superior because you don't wait till the final consumer and you charge the tax. You start to charge upstream, and then based on input credit, people reclaim rather than not pay. So you get the money earlier. And in countries where we have a cash flow problem, besides a revenue problem, that was very interesting. The way in which it was introduced was so bad that people forgot that and assumed that VAT was a new tax. The critical thing, though, is that since we introduced VAT, we've changed it many times. We've tried to go with a flat tax of 3% at retail level without any of the input credit stuff. We've changed it back. We've gone back and forth. One critical point. When was the last time you saw an actual policy analysis of VAT, which then guides the changes? Almost never. There's almost never any attempt to actually engage tax professionals like our very distinguished co-speaker here or others to try and say, how do we do it better? Even when they do that, it's often not with the intent to change the fundamental strategy that they have. It's often just merely to listen to you. And that's what they call consultation in Ghana. So we've had back and forth on VAT, change it this way, move it, and it's made very little impact. Almost every time we introduce a new tax bill, we change the mechanism, and it doesn't really make much of a difference. You look at gift tax in America, for instance, where they use empirical analysis to gauge how much the tax should be. And you compare it to Ghana. Why does nobody pay gift tax in Ghana? Because it makes no sense to pay gift tax in Ghana. After every 50 cedis, you are liable. Why did America set it up at almost $11 million? Because you really wanted to make sure that you enforce it. If you set it up at 50 cedis and everybody is therefore liable or it's infracting, enforcement becomes impossible. It's not possible to get people to pay for everything they receive at 50 cedis and above. Nobody in this room is actually in compliance with the law. When was the last time anybody in this room received something that was 50 cedis and above and paid tax on it? It doesn't make, okay, so I put that back. But almost nobody complies. Almost nobody complies. So designing the tax sensibly with careful empirical analysis and the like is very critical. Last slide, I think. Thank you.
We can do it better than that. So I'll invite Dr. Alina Chia to come back.
Thank you.
Wow, that was very insightful. And from the presentation, I think that the key takeout then is that can we go back? Now that the bill has been passed, the president will give his assent. We are waiting to hear from the Supreme Court. But in the meantime, the bill has been passed. So from the presentation, is it too late then to go back to remodel the tax and go back and consult all the key stakeholders? Because we're seeing that, for example, as you mentioned, the telcos, this tax is going to disrupt the already existing platforms, well thought out platforms, for the banks as well. And then you also raise the issue of the mobile money agents. In fact, it's an interesting point that you raised, that for many people who go and transact through the agent, then the agent has to bear that cost. Now, is the agent now going to transfer the cost back to the customer? So is it too late to go back, even though it has been passed, and look at the nitty-gritties of the implementation? Yes.
The big issue is twofold. One is that we need to, as a matter of culture, start to introduce sunset clauses into laws. So, for instance, if you have said that this law will automatically elapse in 2 years, that would have given us an automatic right to review. But for some reason, a lot of countries do that. The US is very popular. You know, something is controversial. I say, okay, let's watch it for 2 years and see the effect, and then the law automatically lapses. I think we don't do that here. So, two things that I will say quickly. One, we are going to see a lot of challenges with tax administration because this represents one of the biggest digital redesign of a lot of transactional platforms. I mean, some of the exemptions will require unbelievable amounts of auditing to get right. So if I decide that, okay, they say that everybody who is paying back a loan is automatically exempt. Of course, it also presupposes then that they are going to introduce some kind of digital monitoring, for which reason they've decided to put aside about $40 million. But the truth of the matter is that it's not just you who have to put in the monitoring system. It's the person to whom that money is transiting that must first do the redesign. So if I have a platform, I have to find out that you are actually using that money to pay for debt or any other exemption that they introduce. So it means that every time that they introduce an exemption, there has to be redesign of technology platforms. Now the problem that arises is that you have an ongoing engagement with people who know better than you, which potentially could humble them. Because you go back to people and they say, look, this you didn't really think it through. Now you're asking me to enforce it. Here are my challenges. So how do exactly are you proposing that I do it? And then it's back and forth. So one of the things I expect is if they pass the law the way they've done with all these exemptions and things like that, and now they tell the telcos, the fintechs, and all of these people to implement the rules. One of the things I expect is a lot of back and forth between the GRA and the operators. My expectation, though, is this, and that's why I have a problem. They will start to charge before the issues around the exemptions are there. So if I am, for instance, a fintech company and I have an app, and you are using that app to pay some loans you've taken, and we've not yet created a mechanism for you to disclose the loan, for me to verify the loan, and for me to verify that transactions are actually for a loan provider, then I'll just start charging. So I think those things will create uproar. I suspect that people have not thought through the cumulative effect of the tax. People have not thought through how the exemptions are difficult. People have not thought through that this is a tax now on everything, including FDI. So if you manage to get some money from overseas and some person send you $120,000, immediately that person sends you that money. It's an international transaction. Unless they implement a mechanism at the gateway level to apply the tax, then they have to take the tax from you, the recipient. Because the person is in another jurisdiction. So if I'm sending you money from overseas and it's coming to your account and you say the tax applies to the sender, but the sender is not in your jurisdiction, how do you apply the tax? So either apply the tax to you, the recipient, or we all evade. But I'm expecting that what will happen is that they will go for maximal compliance because most people are afraid of the government. I mean the formal operators. And that means that those of us that are the receiving end will suffer. So I don't think there's room to fix it immediately, but there's a lot of political opportunity. As those issues start to come up, and more people begin to realize how badly this was designed, then people like us in the public policy space, in civil society, start to talk about it. That's what I think we will get the opportunity to ask for amendments and things like that. But it's not going to be very easy.
Interesting. So let's take a step back, and I will direct this question to you, Doug. So the E-Levy, as it has been passed, as it pertains to us in this room, can you explain the provisions of the levy? So we hear that there's 100 cedis threshold. Can you just explain to us what the levy is? And then the second question, which I would like you to answer, and Bright Simmons can also answer, why is this levy so important to this government? It's an important question because, again, we've seen the opposition and yet it has been passed. So we all want to understand, again, why it's so important. We've heard that it's going to generate a certain big amount of money needed for our economy. So we need to answer that question. So first, please let's help us to understand the rudiments.
Thank you. I think that if you take, you will find out that they give the threshold that up to 100 Ghana cedis you won't suffer the levy. And like Bright mentioned, who is going to monitor these thresholds? Otherwise, you are saying that the agent would have to suffer it because when people leave the money with the agent to transfer, then that becomes the point. They also talk about if it's a movement from your own account onto your wallet or your wallet to your account, it is exempted. Who is monitoring whose account it is and how many accounts? Because people keep multiple accounts. So these are the challenges, and that is what we expected, that the consultations would have been properly done. But what we had were town hall meetings. Has anybody read any report of the outcome of the town hall meetings? It was rather to maybe sensitize them that we are bringing this tax. I was expecting to hear, at the time the town hall meeting started, the rate was 1.5. Did anybody complain about it to be brought down again? We didn't hear anything like that. As to why is the tax so important, I was entertaining reasons that people bashed me, but thankfully the Minister for Roads came to mention it. But for collateralization, how do you understand why it was more of take it and there's no option? Because if you look at the amount involved, remember when the bill came and the rate was 1.75, the expected inflow was 6.9 billion. And that was granted. The bill starts rolling out 1st February. March is ending. The rate has come from 1.75 to 1.5. We are still talking 6.9 billion. I don't get the mathematics. And then you look at the Bank of Ghana data, the volumes also dropped with the announcement between October and December. But we are being counted with the understanding that from January to March, it is picking up. But on what parameters did we arrive at the 6.9? And is it still 6.9 as we speak? And if you look at the sectors that are earmarked for the use of the E-Levy, one, you talk about creating jobs, the You Start program. I wonder if we've soon forgotten why communication service tax was introduced. Talk tax, to create jobs. And the advert was there for all of us to see. When the boy told the father, oh, taxes, baby, he said, oh, so if it is creating the jobs, why didn't we go to the communication service tax to increase it? Two, you are saying for road infrastructure. Road tolls is not bringing much. Do you abolish it or you leave it and add more? But it was abolished. And if the road toll is bringing us about 6.8 every month, and we are saying the total for the year is about 68 million, I thought the adage is that little drops of taxes makes a mighty nation. Where did that adage of the Ghana Revenue Authority go? Such that you abolish the road tolls and say the E-Levy, a percentage of the E-Levy would go to deal with your roads. We also forget that in the petroleum price build-up, there is some pesos allocated to the road fund. So it is not only the road tolls that brings us money for roads. As at last year, the information is we had $1.2 billion inflow from road fund levy in the petroleum price buildup. But because of the capping law, we had availability of only 800 million because the 400 million will go in service debts. So the question is, why couldn't we look at the sectors that could bring in the revenue and adjust it? Maybe you adjust communication service tax by 0.5. You look at petroleum levy. If it's 46 pesos, you raise it to 50 pesos per liter, and you spread it. Our challenge is not looking at tax equivalencies. And that is, if you are expecting 6.9 billion from E-Levy, where else can I spread and get the same or more without distorting the market too much? A good tax should not distort the market significantly. There would be some distortion, but to what level? And that is why I always agreed with Bryce Simmons where he mentioned that, you know, when you talk about tax policy, it is a process. It's not an event. And so you need to trace and track the repercussions and the flow. Because if you look at the data of the Bank of Ghana as at October last year, we had about 440,000 people employed in the Momo industry, aggregators and what have you. So if the Deputy Minister of Finance indicates that their research showed that the impact will be about 24%, then translate that to the unemployment that will be created. So you create E-Levy with a percentage point to create jobs, and you create unemployment.
Sorry to cut you in, but following what John Kuma said on this 24% attrition, he said that research showed that this attrition would be between the first 3 to 6 months, and hopefully consumers would return. Is that a fair assumption? Because then if they will return, then we are looking at a disruption for a short while.
I think Bright gave the examples in other countries we can learn from. In Uganda, what happened? Did they come back? In Kenya, have they come back? So history is there to guide us. And what we are saying is this. I have always held that a tax is what the law says it is. Borrowing from my mentor, Dr. Benjamin Kumbo, he said a tax is what the law says it is. And you know why I agree with this definition? Everybody is trying to find out whether E-Levy is a direct tax or an indirect tax. What is it on? Is it on the service? Because the amount is my money in my pocket, my wallet, and you are taxing it because I'm giving it to somebody. If it is an indirect tax, shouldn't it be on the charge that the telco will charge me if I use that medium? But if you go that way, then you are reverting to the VAT of financial services you indicated was a nuisance tax and abolished. So you won't go that route. That is where the challenge is. So for me, nobody prevents a government from imposing taxes. The idea why we ask for consultation and stakeholder engagement is to be able to enhance voluntary compliance. But when the person is part of the process, he appreciates the dynamics, the implication, and as Bryce Simmons said, can then reconfigure his systems, modules, and fit into the terrain. He's not saying don't tax me. Nobody loves paying taxes. But then, that is what government needs to develop an economy. But is it the only way to go? And like Bright mentioned, if you look at the lack of consultation and policy analysis in terms of the tenure, you can see what has happened to VAT, flat rate, withdrawn, reintroduced, covers retailers, expanded to include distributors and wholesalers. We come back to retailers. Now we set threshold. So are we doing any policy analysis, impact analysis to inform what we want to do? It is not new. When VAT came in 1995, same problem. Demonstrations withdrawn, stakeholder engagement, successfully relaunched in 98, and it has been with us to date and performing. So the idea is, why can't we take that lesson, fashion out a new tax called electronic levy, and move on? But again, if you say the E-Levy is to rope in the informal sector, I disagree. Why? If I am paying a carpenter or a mason who is in the informal sector, who is to pay the tax? Is it not the painter? Because he is the one not paying. Why should I pay the levy for him? Then you have still not gotten to the informal sector. Again, in the second schedule to the Income Tax Act, there's a provision for modified taxation, presumptive tax, which is also captured in the same budget that we are going to capture the informal sector with presumptive tax, where we can say if your turnover is say 500,000 a year, give us 3% of that, and that's your final tax. It is there. If it is about taxing electronic commerce or digital taxation, the GRA has developed a framework for taxing the digital economy, which the Commissioner General promised is rolling out 1st of April. So, as Bryce said, it is not all transactions via electronic means that is commercial. And again, engagement with the telcos would have given us those who are trading using their mobile money network. If you are sending, you can see when the person's number shows that this is a business account. They could detail them out for us. So I'm surprised about the rush in trying to get it, and that is what makes everybody surprised. What actually is in it that makes it, I don't want to use
so
the word,
important.
do or die.
But before Bright, you come in, what about the other argument? Perhaps looking at more macroeconomic indicators where they said our credit rating went down, there were speculations about our revenue inflows, and therefore the passing of this levy and the expected revenue generation perhaps would raise our rating and then attract the investors. I wanted Bright to take that. Yes.
So I think a number of important observations. One is that, yes, it's true that the government, when it went back to the rating agencies and it did its non-raising roadshow, it went to talk to investors in a roadshow, but it wasn't raising money. This was purely for confidence building purposes. It did make the case that as part of its fiscal consolidation plan, one of the strategies it was adopting for revenue growth was to introduce a tax on electronic transactions. And therefore, this became a matter of policy credibility in that sense. Now, you said you were going to do this, you couldn't do it, and the rest of it. The truth, though, is that the people that observe our economy from afar are not idiots. They can read between the lines, they can look at the analysis themselves, they can look at the impacts and the rest of it. And one of the things we know for sure is that if you put a tax on something and it reduces consumption, particularly if that thing is so pervasive in the economy that it can affect so many other areas, there is a possibility that you could suppress demand across the board. There's a possibility that you can affect confidence. So if I'm a business person and my instinct is that this is a tax that is cumulative. This is a tax that is going to lead over time to higher cost of production. As I was trying to explain, it's a tax that penalizes productive steps. If that is my perspective, I'm probably going to spend less because my confidence is lower. All of these things will have an effect on other taxes in the economy. So that would mean, therefore, that if I'm a good analyst, I'm a good ratings analyst, and I'm looking at it and say, okay, this is your tax, I'm going to ask whether that tax is potentially distortionary, as Dr. Ali Nacha has already mentioned. If I'm going to look at it and see whether the revenue potential of that tax is significant compared to the fiscal holes you have to fix. And I'm going to look at all of those factors before I determine whether or not this should make a difference in the ratings that I'm offering your economy. So yes, there was definitely a sense that we got that because of the comments that the government had made prior to some of the rating actions and after some of the rating actions and the rest of it, it wanted to show that it had power in the economy, power in the society, the political economic factors were in its favor, and it could introduce a tax. And if it couldn't, then it would mean, therefore, that it's lost control. My view, though, is that if we take that as one factor, and we take the other factors also into account, my view is the balance is on the other side. The balance is in the fact that this will affect the political economy to the extent that we're going to see lowered demand should worry the government more. Take CST, which has already been mentioned. One time, the government decided that it was going to increase CST by 50%. What informed the 50% increase? Arbitrariness. Somebody just decided that's what sounds interesting. You know what happened? Overall take from CST actually fell. Then last 2 years, they decided they were going to cut CST from 9% to 5%. In 2021, we actually saw an increase in communication service tax collections. That's very interesting. You increase it by 50%, it doesn't grow revenue. You reduce it by almost an equivalent amount, and you see revenue growth. What is that telling you? It tells you that for taxes that impact areas of our economic behavior, where human agent action is very critical, the fact that people either confidence, sentiment, sense of justice, all of those things are factors. There are people now that are protesting by closing their mobile money account, for example. Regardless of whether or not it's a significant trend, the fact of the matter is that because of the behavior changes it induces, it's not automatic that they will get the money that you're expecting to get. Last point. If you take mobile money alone, you have $110 billion transaction value, as I discussed earlier. So that's a very huge amount of money. The biggest operator in the market, the organization that facilitates the majority of that $110 billion is MTN. 90% or so of mobile money transactions go through MTN. How much did MTN make from that nearly $90 billion or so in terms of transaction value that it facilitated? Just a little above $200 million. So what does that mean? What that means is that MTN, by applying a charge on those amounts and didn't have the same exemption rates and the rest of it as the government, was making just $200 million out of something that was in excess of $90 billion. So if you are the government and you say, I'm going to impose something on a maybe slightly more because you're adding bank accounts and the rest of it, and you think that would generate $1 billion, someone has to ask you, what is the analysis that guides it? if I'm a ratings analyst, I have to ask that question too. So my attitude to your question is that unless the belief is that somehow rating analysts and the like are completely besorted to government propaganda, so whatever it is that the government says, they just take it as, then I don't see how this is an effective response to the issue around fiscal consolidation. I think rather they should propose ideas that doesn't attract the same degree of scorn. Because then you have the, people look at it and go like, this is interesting. I think this is going to work, and there's some degree of respect for what you've introduced. If you introduce something that everybody kind of feel like this doesn't make sense, or there's this problem or that problem, it affects sentiment. And I think that is the mistake that the government made.
One wonders, is the government not shooting itself in its own foot to introduce such a levy amidst the protest? Are we not detracting from our fintech gains? Any one of you can take that.
Obviously, if you increase the cost of something, people do less of it. I mean, it's a standard fact. So if because of the fact that, a bunch of fintech services, now that every time I move money in that medium, I'm charged, and it applies to my cost. So for instance, if I'm introducing a streaming service, and I decide that one of the ways in which people can pay for that streaming service is by Momo or through bank, some kind of bank transfer, automatically I've added 1.5% to the cost. And that 1.5 extra percent is significant if there are other productive steps, like I mentioned. It can become accumulative very quickly. So if there are 3 steps, let's say, first of all, I want to utilize that system in order to achieve something. But to do that, I have to move money from my wallet first into some other system and then move it something. By the time I realize I'm already spending 4.5% because I've done 3 steps, that is very significant. A 4.5% increase in marginal cost is huge in economic terms. Because of that alone, somebody might decide not to act. I think the other critical factor in terms of fintech and the rest is also the fact that we were just about moving into a really digitized economy. A lot of the transactions that we've talked about, these digital transactions, were not supporting actual digital economics. But what do I mean by that? What I mean is that a lot of it was people doing activities offline but paying online. So somebody buying watch but paying by mobile money. That's not necessarily a digital economy transaction. But there are people that want to build real digital economy transactions where I do everything online. So if it's a laundry service, I actually book the laundry online, and the person comes and pick up the item, and I pay online. Now, if because of the fact that there is now a sense that these are all bourgeois, as we like to call it in Ghana, rich people do it because it's expensive, then I don't get involved at all. I don't start to try and get into digital services at all. So you reduce the number of people that will have entered the digital economy because they think, it's for rich people. So you have to be careful the signal you send. Mobile money was super successful because it was successfully marketed, and here was a marvelous achievement of marketing science. And those of you that are marketing scholars here will attest. It was successfully communicated to people as the money alternative, or the alternative to money for poor people. That was very powerful. Now, if there is, the instinct that begins to develop is that, this is for rich people because it's expensive, you stop a significant community from becoming digitalized. And I think that is something that they are not paying attention to. The exemptions are interesting, but the exemptions don't work well when I have multiple accounts, multiple wallets, and unless you have a central mechanism for me to be able to disclose them, then it becomes an identity issue, etc. So you keep complicating what should be a simple situation, because now all of a sudden I have to do more KYC because there's a risk of potential tax evasion, which you've not thought about. So if I run a business and I want to be compliant with the law, you come in and you say this is for one or the other. Because I may exempt you based on your claims, and if I exempt you wrongly, I may also be liable. I am now duty bound to do KYC for something that otherwise I would not do. KYC meaning know your customer. It's a set of regulations that typically makes it more difficult to introduce services. So my argument is that you need to do your analysis so well and then narrow the tax. like they did in Uganda, by finally narrowing the tax to only mobile money into a specific aspect of mobile money, we've decided to attach this tax to every electronic financial transaction in Ghana, whether or not it affects our decision to try and introduce commodity exchanges, stock exchanges. Look at all the things that we think we should be able to do in this economy. None of that has led to critical thinking about whether or not, because you've now added these marginal costs, some business models are no longer viable. You get the point? So you say, okay, all of a sudden, I was going to introduce equity trading, and I wanted to do it online. Then I realized that actually, normally for equity trading or for any of these type of securities, my margins are tiny. To give you an example, if you are in the bond market in Ghana, for instance, sometimes your fees are in the range of about 0.5%. Keep that in mind, about 0.5%. If you introduce a charge on the payment, which is 1.5%, effectively, that is no longer a good business. So you've literally taken a hammer into a whole new space, which is digital securities trading, because all of a sudden you do understand that there are parts of the economy where the margins on profit or the profit margins are around 0.something%. So that's my problem. It's this lack of ability to have a perspective that says, I shouldn't be too arrogant. I don't understand this complexity. So let me keep it on something very small that I can control and observe. They decide to attach it to everything. And I think that was very dangerous.
To add to that, you will find out that in moving towards the cash-light economy, you remember the Vice President launched the e-pharmacy model. So what becomes of people who want to now buy medication through this medium? They are going to suffer 1.5% on the price of whatever medicine or drug you are paying for. Again, just after this Black Stars match, introduction of e-ticket into the stadium came up. Fantastic, and everybody praised it. Now, if the ticket is 50 or 20 cedis, you are going to pay additional 1.5 to access. Then I'll go and queue and buy it cash and be able to watch the match.
But if it's 50, will that attract the E-Levy? Isn't it?
Because you are looking at a situation that you are using that example, but depending on which of the size of the
ticket agent is receiving that amount through their channel.
The ticket agent.
They are remitting it. They may add that charge because they will eventually pay it.
Exactly.
Which is another issue that we have.
Exactly. So let me stay with you, Doc. So clearly, attrition will be a problem. And so, as you already hinted, people will try to evade the tax. How do you envisage that will be done? What are the alternatives that you envisage that people would resort to now to avoid the tax?
The research shows that what happened in places like Uganda and Kenya, especially East Africa, the evasion came through what they call agent banking. That's the term for it, agent banking. So it created an underground economy where somebody can be here and would know that students need to make a payment for an activity. And if they go and pay through the mobile money, this is going to be the cost. So he rallies, takes them, and makes the payment for a fee lower than what he would have paid. That's the agent banking. And that makes it worse because you can't even identify them. You can't track them. That is the danger and the way the evasion may go about. And until the law comes out for us to see what measures the Revenue Administration will also put in to trace and track transactions, it's another matter.
So then we'll be creating a black market. And instead of attracting or having all these people online, we'll be losing them. My question to you, my cherished audience, is how are you going to evade the tax? Do you intend to pay it? And what are your alternatives? I'm interested to know when we get to the Q&A session. So if you've just joined us online, we're having a seminar series, and the topic for discussion, we're considering whether the E-Levy is the solution to our accelerated development. I remember when I shared the flyer on my status, I got feedback from a certain politician who said the government never said that this is the one solution. This is the key solution. It is one of many. It's one of many. I hope you are noting down your questions because very soon you will have the chance to ask your question. Now, this is a question that goes to both of you. Let me read a quote. And in fact, this quote, I got it from a document from DOG. And it's by one Frederick the Great, an 18th century king. He said, "No government can exist without taxation. This money must necessarily be levied on the people, and the grand art consists of levying so as not to oppress." So my question to both of you is that, is this the right time for this levy, given our current economic situation? Is this the right time?
In fact, the timing issue, I think, is one of the most salient aspects of this whole debate, in the sense that when you have a situation where you are faced with two almost contending trends. On the one hand, we have falling demand in the economy. If you pay attention to the composite index of economic activity that the Bank of Ghana puts together, you look at some of the Purchasing Managers Index, you look at the survey report in respect of sentiment of business leaders, a lot of it suggests that we are going to see demand fall. What does it mean? It means simply that people are not going to buy a lot of things going forward. So this tax has an effect that, to my mind, could be very pro-cyclical. What that means is, at a period when you want something to set against another trend, you are rather pushing another trend that will reinforce the one trend you are trying to reverse. What does that mean in simple terms? If people are buying less because inflation is rising, people are buying less because the currency is depreciating, people are buying less because sentiment is a problem, this is not the time to introduce another burden which has the capability or the capacity or the likely effect of being inflationary. Because of the fact that people nobody wants to bear this tax, they're going to pass it through. One of the most important branches of any kind of economic analysis is one of the most important aspects of any type of economic analysis of this nature, especially in welfare economics, is to look at the pass-through effect of a particular intervention or incidence of any kind of activity. So basically, how much of this tax will people pass on as opposed to absorb? Empirical evidence suggests that this is one of those taxes that a lot of people, a lot of the economic actors in the economy want to pass on. So what that means, therefore, is that it has an inflationary effect. If I think that this tax is going to eat into my margin, I'll just increase my prices. At the time when this economy is faced with significant headwinds of an inflationary kind, and the central bank has decided to increase the prime rate by the highest amount we've seen in many, many years, is it the right time to increase anything that has the potential to increase price? I think not. I think not, because I think it will affect demand. I think a lot of the measures the government is introducing now have the effect of likely lowering demand. So I think from a timing point of view, this was very, very unstrategic.
Doc.
So you see history trying to and so for me, I'm happy when you posted a politician indicated that it is one of the many. I think the others are those that should have been concentrated upon for now. And then we would see how the economy will picking up currently gradually from COVID is not the best time to be able to increase more pressure and cost of doing business, as Bright rightly said. So I think that there were other sectors of the economy, other aspects of revenue mobilization that were discussed. And they are all in the budget, looking at property taxation, looking at dealing with tax exemptions that are affecting the revenue base of the economy. We talked about also trying to look at dealing with corruption. Because if you look at the Commission for Human Rights and Administrative Justice research they did with the Ghana Integrity Initiative, We lose over $3 billion every year from corruption. And what were we expecting? $1 billion from E-Levy. So it means that if we save all this, it goes to shore up our domestic revenue base. If you look at the road tolls that were abolished, everywhere in the world there are tolls. Why couldn't we review the 1 cedi per four-wheel drive upwards and the 50 pesos upwards to see what it will be? If it is about leakages and corruption in that sector, have we abandoned hopes of fighting it? And even with digitization, why didn't we go to e-ticketing and e-card to cross toll booths instead of going to pay? Even the existing ones, we have lanes for e-tickets. We could convert all to e-tickets. Legon, we do the same. Go to the airport, you use the ticket to enter, park, pick your passenger, and go out. What was difficult about doing e-ticket for the toll booths? There were options.
So, gentlemen, would you not give the government any credit? Isn't there any good in this levy? Isn't there any good in this levy? What are the positives? There must be.
You know, though, that I did mention that the E-Levy is not a monolith. It depends on exactly how you design it. So it's very difficult to discuss anything other than the levy as it was designed. There are ways in which, as we've already mentioned, and I think Dr. Nachi has made a very extraordinary statement in respect of digital taxation and very little to say to its credit. On the other hand, nobody is saying that we don't appreciate the fundamental issue that triggered the tax. There are two of them. One being the fact that the government does intend to increase how much of our GDP goes to the government as opposed to the private sector. In Ghana, as has been said many times, it's often below 15%, though I think that some of it is also definitional issues. Often when we are looking at the Ghana figure, we are not looking at the other forms of revenue that the government gets in royalties from minerals, etc. We are looking only at tax revenue. But when we are comparing with the African average, we tend to compare it with the tax revenue to GDP as opposed to the government revenue in general, because some of the databases don't report the government revenues in general. The truth, though, is that because Ghana is such a natural resource-rich country, the government gets so much of its revenue outside taxation, which a lot of the other West African countries, as an example, don't get. So all those are factors, but we do acknowledge that it's the government's interest, as in the case of more advanced countries, to gain more out of GDP than it currently does. We also do acknowledge that the economy is fast digitizing, and therefore some of the traditional and conventional means of earning revenue as a government are constrained. And for that reason, it's in government interest to come up with new measures to try and catch up. We acknowledge all those premises. What we disagree with is that to take your inspiration from the premise and then to massacre it the way they've gone about and massacred it. As in the approach that they've taken, the way they've designed it, the way they've designed exemptions, the way that they've gone about with caps, the fact that they did not put a total cap on how much potentially you could pay. Almost every ad valorem you can look at, except in the traditional excise space, most type of ad valorem arrangements of this nature, there will be a maximum cap. All of those things were not done. So it does not distinguish between somebody who is sending money as capital for investment versus somebody who is sending money as part of consumption. And that is just partly designed. And I think that's been the challenge. So we acknowledge the pressures on the government. What is driving the government to try and achieve this? We just think they should have consulted more, not in the way they currently do consultation, which is to tell you what they plan to do, but consultation where they intend to say, here is the problem, what are the best approaches out there that can help us get there?
Doc, your comment on this.
And then also to talk about whether there is anything or there's nothing good about it. Like Bright said, we've not stated that. And we gave options. You gave a quotation that you need to tax to develop a country, but you don't tax so as to oppress. The proposition is that from the data that Bright displayed in the presentation, you find out that in Cameroon, where they started 0.2% in January, and Cote d'Ivoire, the 0.5%, that is where you are putting the levy on the value like we are doing. None of them is in the range of 1%. So if you intend to even go ahead with it, why not below 1%? So as not to oppress. Because for the countries, especially we've referred to in East Africa, 1%, 1 point, it is on the fee that is charged by the telcos, not the value of the transfer. So there were options to let it not oppress. That is the bottom line.
Corruption, and that's something we need to keep an eye on. So we're going to charge E-Levy. Some monies will definitely come in. How can we ensure and demand accountability and the proper use of the money? The areas the money is intended to be used for are a bit nebulous. We don't know exactly, you pointed out exactly what will be done, but how can we demand accountability?
Thank you. I think with the areas they indicated in the budget that a percentage would go into road infrastructure, another in employment creation, job creation, and the next was in cybersecurity space. The issue about accountability is key. And that is where we wait to see how the Revenue Administration is going to set its monitoring mechanism. I have a challenge because before the merger of the revenue institutions, we had the value-added tax service. They were conducting what we call verification visits almost every quarter to check whether the VAT returns taxpayers had filed comply or are consistent with the records in the organizations. After the merger, we only have the tax audits, which will take some years before it gets. Now you realize that when VAT came in, it was bringing in more revenue than the direct tax, as in corporate tax and the PAYE employee taxes. Today, direct taxes bring in more income than value-added tax. Why? I believe the challenge is with monitoring. Today, you still go to shops and they ask whether you want VAT invoice or not. Is that an option when the law says you have to pay? And then when you are given a receipt and you challenge, this is not a VAT receipt. They tell you if you want the VAT receipt, then the price will be different. It will be higher. So it tells you either they are charging the VAT and not remitting to government because they are not accounting for it and nobody is monitoring. We need to make sure the revenue starts a monitoring exercise on all taxpayers. The second aspect of monitoring, you heard the minister mention over 60,000 professionals are not paying taxes, yet they are against E-Levy. I have always been against the statement that professionals don't pay tax. They pay, unless you don't understand taxation. We have direct tax and indirect. Every consumption the professional consumes, he pays a tax. And if he's a professional and he has a four-wheel drive, remember, in buying fuel, he's paid more taxes than somebody who is using a low-capacity engine vehicle. If because he is a professional, he eats in Kimpiski, he is paying higher tax than the one who is eating at, what do you call, on the walk or on the run? The chop bars. So you tell me, and also as a consultant, any work you do, if you are being paid, the law requires the person paying you to withhold tax. As a consultant, I'm sure you've got a lot of withholding tax credit certificate. So if it is the issue that they do not fully disclose all their income, then we can engage. But in any case, the Revenue Administration Act is clear, which came in since 2016, that every professional is required to produce a tax clearance certificate before his practicing certificate can be renewed. Lawyers, accountants, doctors by the Medical and Dental Council since 2016. Who has stopped anybody from enforcing the law? So if you are not enforcing the law, you are not monitoring, and you claim people are not complying, who are you crying to? What can we do? You need to enforce the law. So these are the gaps and lapses in terms of monitoring and compliance that we can. I keep saying that, look, the revenue generation in this economy can be likened to fetching water with a bucket that has holes. The bucket is leaking. You keep fetching the water. It's draining out. So you keep adding more taxes, and you are not monitoring by way of sealing the leakages. The bucket will never be full. That is how we keep going with additional taxes. So I believe until we have sealed the leakages, the loopholes, enforce compliance through monitoring, and then we can say we are still not getting enough, then I would believe we don't have enough taxes. But we have more than enough.
We have more than enough taxes. Thank you very much, my expert panel. Let's appreciate them with a round of applause. Very interesting conversation so far. Now it's time to hear from you. So I would like to have questions from the audience. If you're online, please post your question in the chat and it will be read out to our panelists. So can I have the first question? Do we have a question?
Yes, Madam Moderator, those online are itching to be heard. This is a question. Should I read them in turns, or I can read all the questions?
How many questions do we have?
I have 3 questions so far. 4, sorry.
Let's have the first 2. We take the answer and then we can go to the next 2.
Okay, so this is from Samuel Owusu. And his question is, we have been told about the transactions E-Levy covers. What transactions are not covered by E-Levy? That is a question.
Can we have the second?
And the second is from Frank Bwedu. Back to the question of the day. Would the E-Levy accelerate Ghana's development? That is a question he's asking.
Thank you, our online audience. So after these 2 questions, we have a hand in-house, so we'll take that question. So over to you, gentlemen.
Are not covered. Okay, so transactions obviously up to a threshold of 100 Ghana cedis are not covered. If you are paying through the government platform, the ghana.gov, which presupposes therefore that you are paying a government agency, it's exempt. If you are paying a loan amount or repaying a loan amount or paying interest, so long as the entity that it's receiving that money is duly registered, that is also exempt. Also exempt are payments related to, let me recollect. This was just on the back of my mind. Own accounts. If the transfers are between accounts that are owned by the same individual, that are also exempt. So for now, that's primarily what we know. Clearing of a check. So checks are not electronic transactions. Okay, so that would be B2B. So if within the clearing system, okay.
Can you explain that part?
Okay, so when you send a check, let's say I give you a check, you pay your check to your bank. The bank scans it, something called CCS. They scan the check and upload it to a national platform. Now, in that national platform, the check then gets processed. It's similar to normal settlement. So it's the payment may actually happen through something like an ACH or something like that. That process being exempted. Otherwise, then it will have meant that even if you use a check will have been subject because the person will have to pass on the processing fee.
Thank you very much. And the second question? Yes.
Is the answer to the accelerated rate? Of course not. I think as you've rightly pointed out, even the government ministers and other politicians have not said it's the answer. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So there was a hand up, Eric. So we'll take a question from Eric and then Jonathan.
All right. My name is Eric. I'm a communication student. at Wisconsin, and thank you very much for your presentation and the insightful conversation we've had so far. So I have two questions, and anybody can take it. So my first question is, the government have made it seem that it was almost impossible for government business to go on without the E-Levy, which means that I don't know what's happening in the economic space there, which meant that revenue needed to be mobilized as soon as possible. From the presentation, it showed that something as E-Levy is very complex and needed more time. What would you have advised for the government to use to raise money for the short term, especially if they have that particular problem that it seems to say? That's the first question. The second one is, I find it worrying that you mentioned that most of the assumptions about the tax was very arbitrary. Are there any safeguards, policy guidelines that direct the executive in how to implement taxes in the country? Because I'm wondering, if that's not the case, then, especially at that highest level, for we to just make arbitrary assumptions, that could be very dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that if you observe, government took the necessary steps when there was a delay in the passage of the E-Levy by cutting down expenditure. Anytime I discuss taxation, I don't want it being seen as if we only talk revenue, revenue, revenue. We raise revenue to spend. As I keep saying, if you want to wear three-piece suit, what I wear with agbada, and your material is not enough, you so Senegal, you are also nice. When you insist you want to be in the three-piece suit, that is where the problem arises. So I was happy they started relooking at expenditure, because I don't believe in cutting your coat according to your size. Rather, cut it according to your material. So if my material was not enough, I would have reduced this to a short sleeve kaftan, and I'll be fine. Before even the E-Levy, the question is what I mentioned. What tax equivalences were discussed in the policy space? Like Bright mentioned, policy is a process. So did you think about what if my E-Levy hits a snag? What else? Because there is no second option. Even when we're going to schools, we select first choice, second choice, third choice. Is the executive telling us they didn't do those options to find a way out? You see the challenge? That is where the problem is. And then talking about the process, budget was presented way back in November. My advice was, can we hold on to the levy? Do stakeholder engagement November, December. January, we would have had a consensus. We relay in January. 1st February, you take off. It was ignored, late before Parliament, and then when it was rejected, the town hall meetings start. So I asked myself, who gets married before going for marriage counseling? Don't you do marriage counseling before you get married? So now you are married, you go for counseling, you expect the counselor to tell you, stop the marriage? It's not possible. And that is where you do all you can to let the marriage continue, which is what we found ourselves in. It should be E-Levy and no turning back. Thank you.
I have very similar comments. I think the way you understand the government's serious disinterest in actually having some of those safeguards apply to this is the fact that they choose to go by certificate of urgency, right? They continually go to Parliament and insist that we read the bill, we debate, and immediately gets passed. That's the degree of respect they have for the official policy-making process. So if the official policy-making process, which is parliamentary deliberation, the rest of it is not respected, then it's not surprising that the informal policy-making processes, such as what we are having today in the civil society movement and the rest, is also not respected. So my sense is, it's not that there isn't a mechanism to achieve these things. It's that we as a citizenry have allowed the political class to run roughshod over us for so long, even in the context of democracy. There are places in Africa where we can't have this kind of debate. Clearly not in Eritrea. So in Ghana, where we can have this debate, if we don't push for politicians to listen to us, then actually we are really, 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 really problematic as a society, because we have more freedoms than many other African countries. Why do we not use our freedoms to push for the political class to listen more to us? The second response is in relation to where we can make money from. And there I completely side with Dr. Lenacha. Cost rationalization is our biggest revenue generator in our circumstances. Why? We have some of the worst value for money situations you can ever contemplate anywhere in the world. I'll give you an example. Recently, I've been studying our aviation sector alone. I've been shocked at the quality of spending in airport development. I'll give you a few examples. You go to Kumasi, which we've been trying to convert into an international airport from 2014. So it's been 8 years since we've been trying to make it an international airport. We spent almost $200 and something million on this process. It's a $300 million project. Different governments have spent money on Kumasi. At one point, we spent more on one runway renovation. Basically, we're renovating one runway, which was a 2-kilometer runway, than Ethiopia spent on building a whole new airport plus a 3-kilometer runway. Is that bad? We spent $200 million so far on Kumasi or more. Next door, Togo has spent $150 million building a brand new terminal at Lomé International. And you know the relative capacity of the two airports? By the time Kumasi is through, by the time you are done with the international airport in Kumasi, it will not still be able to carry more than 250,000 passengers a year. Lomé, after their renovations, can now handle 2 million passengers. That's an additional 2 million passengers from $150 million of spending. We've had situations where in Addis Ababa, in order to be able to accommodate an extra 7 million passengers, they spent about $325 million or $335 million, depending on exchange rate. In Kotoka, just to be able to increase passengers to 5 million from about 2.5 million, we spent $250 million. So there's this unbelievable recklessness when it comes to spending our money because of the broken accountability mechanisms in the formal process in Parliament and informally in place like this. We're not putting them under enough pressure. Academics are not sufficiently critical. Civil society activists are not sufficiently critical of government. We have a situation where not a single serious protest by any serious civil society organization about E-Levy. In Uganda, I counted more than 30. What is going on in Ghana? So my view is that our problem is not merely an issue with governance per se, it's a social crisis. There's a crisis of culture, an inability of the Ghanaian population, the Ghanaian civilization, to rise to its manifest destiny and to put the political class under the requisite scrutiny that it requires to build this civilization anew. The Ghanaian civilization is in decline because we don't want to sacrifice. The elite don't want to sacrifice. Nobody wants to come across as a critic of the government because they will lose their consultancies, because they will lose their respect and their prestige. And if we live in that kind of society, we will not be able to fix this country, no matter how much we lament. I think that's the fundamental problem.
The issue about the certificate of agency he mentioned. I mentioned the tax expenditures forming a big chunk of the loss of revenue to us. The tax exemptions bill, which is required to stem the tide of the loss in granting of exemptions, has been in Parliament since 2017. It hasn't seen agency. E-Levy has seen agency. Think about it.
Point. The tax exemptions work for rich people because Parliament has to give you the exemption for the most part. There are instances where the Commissioner General can make some, but for the most part, Parliament has to give you the exemption. To be able to qualify for a parliamentary exemption, you have to be a very powerful, rich, well-connected person. So if you look at the people that are granted the exemption, they are all big businesses. We have one airport in one hotel in an airport. What is the social productive contribution for a hotel, a luxury hotel? In the airport, it's the most exclusive suburb in Accra. For which reason Parliament must convene to give an exemption. Why are they not giving exemptions to people that are doing rice farming in the north? So you have to ask yourself the nature of society in which you live the nature of justice in that society, what is the good society in that respect. And I think that as being in an academic setting, and most of you are students, that really is the way you have to start looking at your society. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So, Fifi, Jonathan, Oscar. This question goes to Mr. Simmons. Mr. Simmons, I want to ask, with your last part of your submission, you talked about the social society and also some of the, say, Imani and their works, how they criticize government and policies. Should we also say that Imani is gradually losing its voice? But to my main question now, the question is that if the road minister have made it clear to us that this money that we are getting from E-Levy is going to be collateralized for us to get more loans, is that not going to be effective than going to the IMF? And do you even suggest the IMF as an option to our difficult times that we are in? And the second question is, let's look at the windfall that is coming from the petroleum industry, kind courtesy Ukraine-Russian crisis. Now we know how fuel prices have gone up, and we are also in this industry and we are producing. I see how you put on Twitter how you've been reading on this petroleum stuffs. Can we say that what is coming in will be enough to substitute what will be generated from E-Levy, and for that matter, we can withhold the E-Levy, get what we are getting as a windfall from the petroleum industry, then we put it in the system. Then the civil societies will go engage government. And in your engagement, you don't look like you inform us, the citizens, what government have engaged you on, except what Dr. Abdullah just mentioned, that they already take the decision, come and inform you that, oh, this is what we are doing, and we just want to inform you. I mean, this is the first time hearing this. Thank you.
So, I mean, one, Imani, I think, is in a context where, because of social media proliferation, the competition for voices has become very intense. So I've been looking at the output of Imani from the point of view of actual articles published or papers submitted, and it's actually risen over the last 2-3 years. But everybody I meet says they don't hear of Imani as much as they used to, which is surprising. So that tells you that I think the competition for voices, for attention in the social economy in that sense, you have to think of attention as almost like an economic commodity. The more supply there is, the greater the competition in that sense, price may fall, value may fall in a sense. So now I think so many more people are talking and contributing to the debate, of course, of varying quality, if I have to say, I'll make that clear. But the truth is, if you went into, let's say, someone like yourself, who is, I presume, younger than 30, you use a lot more social media channels like YouTube, Facebook, and the like. The likelihood that you find a video blogger dominating the ether, so to speak, essentially having more views, etc., than an Imani publication is very high. So it's not that surprising that you don't hear of Imani as much as you used to, because if I ask you when was the last time you went to the Imani website, I doubt you've been to the Imani website for the last 2 years. Because you expect to hear of Imani by nature of the media infrastructure itself. You don't normally go looking for what Imani has said. You expect that Imani will percolate. Either you hear them on radio or you hear them on social media. The problem is, when there's so much competition for attention, they will not filter through. So unless you are an Imani fan who follows them, you get the newsletters, you go on the website, it's not surprising that you would think Imani is not doing as much, but they're doing a lot. The latest research on the ports and how much we are leaking at the ports, I bet you have not heard of it. I bet even Madam Moderator has not heard of it. Most people don't have heard of it. And that's because it's hard to compete. You cannot compete with video bloggers who spend 10 minutes to make a video and get 1 million views. You just don't have that, because you will spend months doing some really stellar research at the port, write a paper, and you find that academics in this school will also complain because they write in journals and they never make the news because the competition is intense. So I think we have to find a way in which either those of us that want to do serious policy commentary and the rest create our own communities, because we're not going to be able to compete with video bloggers. So that would be my response in respect to Imani. On the second issue regarding what was it? Substitutes for, is it substitutes for E-Levy? You did mention about petroleum, but you have, yeah, but you said something before that. You said something in the middle. Collateralization of the revenue. Well, yeah, I mean, our experience with collateralization in this country is problematic. The most famous of which is the Energy Sector Recovery Levy, the ESLA bonds. So we know that the ESLA bonds were brought in to stabilize the economy by looking at the system-wide or the industry-wide shortfalls and then continually paying those debts down to make. What we are seeing now is that whenever government borrows, a good chunk of that money is going to reprofiling debt. So they're not really reducing the debt stock. That's actually the big problem. A lot of the money is being borrowed to simply allow the government to extend how much time that they've got to pay by replacing debt for debt, as opposed to reducing principal. Secondly, with ESLA, the experience we got is that they were not using it for the intended purpose because money is fungible. It goes into a consolidated fund. They apply to other liabilities. So even if we did what you expect that we would do with E-Levy proceeds by collateralizing it, it does not necessarily mean that we'll be able to unlock additional resources because of our tendency not to fix the root causes of issues to generate resources. The other issue is that we don't invest in areas that have significant return on investment. So if you look at some of the areas that we've applied money, look at MASLOC and all of these WIUC programs. When was the last time we had an independent assessment? As in, we had an organization that is not of the government, not some Ministry of Monetary and Evaluation that reports to the cabinet, but a truly independent body invited in by the government, and said, or rather asked to do a proper review of the impact of MASLOC, YEA. You remember there was a time we used to have youth in basket weaving, youth in whatever. All of those activities, and we spent billions of dollars on them. When was the last time you saw an actual independent review? None. So we have a challenge with how we use the tax money as well, which brings us to the issue of tax windfalls or windfall revenues from the petroleum sector. We have a challenge there. A lot of the time we are computing the potential windfall on the basis of price rises on the international market, but on the spot market. Some of the companies in our oil basin are selling forward. They are trading the futures market. Some of them are hedging significant quantities. What that will mean, therefore, is that if they decide to sell a good chunk of the petrol they produce or the petroleum they produce at $70, and the oil price goes up to $100, if you know your standard option theory, they don't make a return. The way that it's designed is that you have a commitment to sell at that particular amount. And because a hedge is not a put, which you can say, I don't exercise. So the way in which we do our hedging in the oil industry is not subject to regulation. We don't have the Petroleum Commission looking and saying what the type of instrument are you using to hedge. Because if we had regulation in that department, then it's possible that we may use instruments where if we are in the money, we exercise. If we are not in the money, we don't exercise. But if you're using hedges, then you literally sell at that price. My view of the matter is that we don't have sufficient clarity in these matters. The Petroleum Commission will not respond. They will not engage policy analysts. They will not do a meeting where there's proper engagement or review of their activities. Everything is PR. The only time you see them comment or publish anything is if they think they have done something worthy of praise. We've trained 100 more welders. But there's no attempt to actually debate themselves. So here is our strategy. Here is a white paper. What do you think? And there's very little of that in Ghana. My experience, Kenya, Senegal, Nigeria, even in some respects, do better in policy making consultation than we do by far. I've seen more white papers in Kenya where, let's say the Petroleum Commission will publish a paper and say, look, these are some of our thoughts about regulation in the space. Local content is not working. We think these are some of the challenges. What do people think? And then they will actively try and solicit views and have a debate. In Ghana, if it's not PR, they will not publish. If it's not, here is something that you need to praise us about, they will not publish. It makes it really difficult to do serious policy analysis, serious policy activism in this country because of the nature of the governance system we've created. I don't know if that answers your question, but...
Yes, thank you. And so as not to draw us into the larger conversation about the economy. So time is fast spent and we want to draw the curtain down. Okay, we'll take our last question from our lady because we've had 2 questions from 2 gentlemen. So after this, and then we'll take your final comments on this E-Levy that has been passed.
All right, so mine is not a question. The topic we have today is E-Levy the answer to Ghana's accelerated development? I think we have spent so much time digesting issues on the fundamental basis and everything, the process and all of that. But to me, personally, I think it is a big no. Yes. With all the points that we have coordinated from our panelists, it's a very big no. Now, one of my lecturers, in the person of Ms. Enyuna Morte Aponsan, she says E-Levy is a double tasking, and then tax is paid is a tax that is paid on the service that is charged on your services. Double taxation, which is not fair. It is not fair to all concerned citizenry, and a way of exploiting. And it is unfair because it is a wicked way of making money. It doesn't make sense. So basically, my personal contribution to whatever we have discussed so far is that E-Levy is not the answer for Ghana's accelerated development. Like our panelists said, all taxes, all structures that are supposed to be placed for the implementation of E-Levy or passing of it or whatever, the process is not right. And this is not favorable to us all, whether you agree with me or you disagree. That is my view. Now, talking about the fundamentals, I think that E-Levy itself wasn't sensitized for all of us to understand. Even right now, even if you go to the on the street and you ask a layman person, what is E-Levy? They don't even know. We still have students of Wisconsin, as and now, if you ask them what is E-Levy, they don't know. So all boils down to what? 1, leadership. 2, poor management. 3, poor structures. 4, poor sensitization. That one is very, very important. Like he was talking about the mobile money something. You know, that one was actually sensitized for all Ghanaians to understand the concept and the basis before any other thing. So we are pleading. I mean, this whole thing is not going to work out. It's affecting both you and I. It's affecting everyone, the layman on the street, even common school fees that we are paying. You're going to pay 4 times of what is going to be levied on that E-Levy tax that you are going to be paid. And we have not even finished tackling all the other areas of taxes like VAT, our property tax, our rent tax, whatever it's, I mean, all the other taxes. We have not finished with digesting the basis of all those structures. And then we are coming to add up E-Levy. This is not favorable for us as a citizenry. And as an institution, because I'm speaking as a representative of Wisconsin, it is not going to help us. So, to conclude, E-Levy, as at this moment, where the country is is poised, we are all frustrated. I mean, everything is in chaos, it's in a mess. We're talking about fixing of the country. We have not tackled all these areas, and this is not going to help us as Ghanaians. So we are saying, I am saying, a personal big no, that E-Levy is never the answer to Ghana's accelerated development. So far as we are experiencing hyperinflation plus flying inflation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that spirited contribution. So can we have your final comments, gentlemen, your recommendations to government? Dr. Alina Chia, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much. I have always indicated that my advice to government has always been, can we block all the loopholes, leakages in the system? Can we look at rationalizing government expenditure? A lot has been said. If you look in the 2022 budget and see the figure that has been budgeted for flagship programs, you'll be amazed. We have some we cannot touch because, well, for them, they have earmarked funds. Like free SHS is oil money. It has nothing to do with E-Levy. So when I heard if without E-Levy, free SHS will be affected, I'm like, what informed discussion is this? So I think that we need to plug the loopholes, be more efficient and effective in revenue mobilization, because can you imagine pre-COVID, GRA was not meeting targets. 2 years of COVID, 2020, 2021, they exceeded target. It shows that they have some level of efficiency they put in through automation. and what the ICOMS, the Integrated Customs Management System at the port, was doing for them. And the Commissioner General also mentioned they put an eye on the extractive sector that Bryce Simmons mentioned. So it shows that indeed, with the effective and efficient mobilization effort, we can still reap more than we anticipate from the E-Levy. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Far more appropriate. Oh, okay, sorry. It's quite evident that if we've listened carefully, the last set of comments made by my very esteemed co-panelists summarizes most of the issues that have arisen in this conversation. There are better alternatives to E-Levy. E-Levy itself, even if we're going to pursue it, needs a lot more work, which we haven't done. Generally, the more complex a tax, the worse it is for everybody, from an administration point of view, collections point of view, efficiency and incidence point of view, from every aspect. And the more you listen to E-Levy, I'm sure you will agree with me that the more it becomes clear to you that it looks more complex than you initially thought. That is often not a good sign. When a tax is very complex, as you begin to unravel it, it often means that administration will be difficult. If administration will be difficult, usually it will be costly, and it also will distort economic behavior. In simple terms, we still have the opportunity as a country, we are a sovereign country, to say, well, we passed the law, but when it comes to these administrative structures and the rest of it, if we think we're going to have a chance, we can go back to Parliament and reform. And I will urge that notwithstanding the fact that this has been passed, all of us as good citizens should add our voice, just as the very brave lady did a few moments ago. We should add our voice that the way it's currently been designed and been rolled out does not work for us, and we ask our representatives who work in our name to listen to our voices and work towards reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're all being called upon to contribute our quota to national development. Let's always participate in seminars like this to share our contribution. Thank you very much, our distinguished panel, Dr. Ali Nachia and Bryce Simmons, for your insightful contributions. And thank you, my in-person audience. You've been great, and our online audience on Facebook Live and Zoom. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll now hand over to Nuruddin to wrap up proceedings. Let's appreciate our panelists again with a loud applause.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we also do for our moderator, Madam AC? You've done a good work. Thank you very much. Obviously and understandably so, many of our followers or audience chose convenience. They chose to be online. And also because of the cost of fuel, people want to minimize their movements around. Our panel members, we thank you so much. We hope that when we call on you again, you make time to join us to have another discussion 1 year after the passage of this bill. The faculty members, School of Business, Mr. Mamadou, the Dean, we did this together with Professor Asai Kofi. Your contributions having gone unnoticed. Ladies and gentlemen, next will be the law school. We are privileged to have a retired High Court, is it a Supreme Court judge, Justice Atuguba, who would be making a presentation to us, hopefully next month. We hope that you can join us on that seminar series. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Madam Catherine to give us a closing prayer.
Thank you very much. Please, let's bow our hands in prayer. Our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth, most gracious and ever-living God. We thank you this evening for how far you've brought us. We thank you for the gift of life, and we thank you for the life of our panelists and also our moderator. We thank you that everything we learned here, Lord, will not be in waste, but we will work on it. And by the end, honor and grace will be upon the name of the Lord. For these and many other blessings we ask. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much for coming, and wish you safe journey back to your destinations. Can we please do a quick photo? Cameraman? Can we Yes.
Oh, Lord of mercy.